Welcome to Green and Red, Scrappy Politics for Scrappy People, a regular podcast on radical environmental and anti-capitalist politics, brought to you by Bob Bazanko and Scott Parkin.
Welcome to the silky smooth sounds of the Green and Red podcast. I'm your co-host, Scott Parkin, in Berkeley, California. Bob is off on assignment today, but I'm sure he'll be back with us soon. But today I am joined by Josh Davidson, who is an abolitionist who's been involved in numerous projects supporting people in prison, supporting political prisoners. He actually is part of the Certain Days collective that publishes an annual Freedom for Political Prisoners calendar, which we on the Green and Red podcast have hosted other members of that collective. And then we also have used the calendar. Josh is holding it up also for our end of year fundraising, which we're doing again this year. Josh also works in communications with the Zinn Education Project. And then and this is the topic of what we're going to be talking about today, is he's the co-editor with recently released political prisoner named Eric King of a book called Rattling the Cages, which he also is showing up there because I have none of my props with me today. Josh, welcome to the Green and Red podcast.
Thanks so much for having me, Scott.
Yep. And so this is a project between you and political prisoner Eric King, Rattling the Cages. It's filled with the experience and wisdom of over 30 current and former North American political prisoners. Actually, let's just talk with some breaking news that happened this week related to the book, which is that your co-editor, Eric King, who had been in prison for something like 10 years, actually got released this week. Could you actually tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's quite a coincidence. This is a book project that we started when COVID first hit, so about 4 years ago. And it was released on December 5th, and he was released to a halfway house a week after that. So he got there on Tuesday after being in some of the most violent and infamous prisons in the US for the last decade for an act of nonviolent property destruction following the police murder of Michael Brown. So he's finally out after a decade of us fighting to get him out, and he's excited to not only be with his family, but also to start publicizing this book and find out what people think about it.
Oh, excellent. Maybe we can have him on a future show as well.
That'd be great.
And just to get to the book a little bit, it's where you have interviewed a number, I think it's something like over 30 former radicals, Black liberation militants from the 60s and 70s, current anti-fascists, Animal and Earth Liberation Front saboteurs, some of which we may be friends with on the podcast, as well as nonviolent Catholic peace activists and a lot of other folks who fall into this like bucket of a political prisoner in North America. And I guess my first question is that the U.S. government actually officially states that there are no political prisoners in North America. And when we think about it, an iconic political prisoner, we think about maybe like Nelson Mandela or someone like that. And I'm wondering if you could actually just like begin with what you think about the U.S. government saying that.
Sure. And I may be getting my history wrong here. I hope not. But I think it was Julian Bond who was with the UN under the Carter administration who admitted that there were political prisoners in the US, and he was promptly fired immediately after saying that. And the US has held strong to that conviction ever since, that people in their prisons have been convicted of crimes. They're criminals and they're not political prisoners. People who do support political prisoners, people in the movement, tend to think of them as people who have fought back against the system, have fought back against racism, sexism, imperialism, and the intersections of all of them, in the hopes of creating something better. And they were caught and imprisoned for doing so. The terminology it's changed over the years. There's also politicized prisoners, political prisoners, socially conscious prisoners. So there's a lot of terminology, but generally speaking, it refers to people who are in prison for fighting the state.
And what do these interviews, and feel free to just cherry pick any of the interviews or any the conversations you have, teach us about prison life and the political commitments that continue to lead prisoners in direct confrontation with the state and different state institutions? We're often hearing about hunger strikes and riots and things like that.
Yeah, it's a great question. And like you said, I interviewed a wide range of people. There were younger people who are involved in Animal or Earth Liberation Front actions or like cyber attacks, things like
Mhm.
that, who like Jeremy Hammond, yeah, or like Jake Conroy with the Animal Liberation Front, or Daniel McGowan and Rebecca Rubin with the Earth Liberation Front, all of whom I interviewed. They spent probably a decade or less in prison. More recently, there are people I spoke to, like Herman Bell of the Black Panther Party and the Black Liberation Army, and his co-defendant Jalil Muntaqim, who spent 45 and 50 years imprisoned, respectively, and others from the 70s and 80s who spent 40, 50 years in prison. So there's a wide range of people from different movements, of people from different generations, but they did have many things in common during the conversations that I had. One of those is that you shouldn't give up, that the state is going to throw everything they have at you, and that's the very point of prison, but it can be beat. Our movement has shown that it can beat the system and that people can survive years and decades of incarceration, and we will continue to do so. Not losing hope was one of the big things that I noticed in a lot of the interviews.
Mhm.
Also, just the continuous, almost like nonstop, it's inherent in them, ability and willingness to fight back at every possible stop, whether they're in solitary confinement where they haven't been able to speak to people, or they're like in Eric's case in 4-point restraint where they're just held for hours on end, unable to move while they're beat by guards or other inmates. All the people I interviewed were just nonstop ready to continue the struggle, whether on this side of the bars or the other.
That was one thing I found interesting, is just the sort of the anecdotes of different methods of resistance, different methods of organizing that these folks, even though they often went to prison for essentially being organizers against the state or against corporations or whatever, they were still fighting that and organizing even once they were in prison, even though they were in a situation where it's dominated by race politics and gang politics. And it's the kind of place where if you step to the wrong place, you can get kicked in the head, things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a type of violence that I think you and I just really couldn't imagine, not to speak for you, but I know couldn't
Yeah.
even imagine the type of violence that they see on a daily basis.
Yeah.
To be able to not only survive that, but to do that with their morals and their principles and their politics intact, I think shows the type of people that they are.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry,
Go
go
ahead.
ahead.
No, you go ahead.
I was just going to say there's one quote from Ed Mead, who was a member of the George Jackson Brigade, who I interviewed. He just died a few weeks ago. And he spent I think 30 or 40 years in prison, and he never stopped fighting in every way possible. He wrote newspapers, he created journals, and he also just advocated flooding your cell, burning whatever's there, and just fighting in any way possible. So, yeah, it was inspiring to hear so many people say similar things.
It's also interesting. There's some folks you interviewed who just did months in jail, I believe. And then there were folks who just did a shorter amount of years, like less than 5 or something like that. But then there's people like Ed Mead, who spent 30 or 40 years in prison, which is a lifetime or half a lifetime or something like that. And to me, there is a level of despair and depression that would come with just facing that amount of time. And I wonder if you could speak about any conversations you got into about how they were able to deal with that despair. Like, how did they handle it?
Yeah, that's a good question. And it is something that luckily I was able to talk to several of the contributors about, but unfortunately it's something that I'd say probably half of the contributors are having to deal with. Other people that spent so much time in prison and now they're older, they're elderly, and they're facing the consequences of decades of medical neglect from prison.
And shitty diets and all kinds of things.
Yeah, exactly. Shitty diets, not seeing the sun for years on end.
Yeah.
But I do think that it's a connection to younger movements, to ongoing movements, and to feeling like they're still a part of the struggle while inside. And I think that does tend to keep political prisoners not only active, but just ready to go. And I think of Jalil Muntaqim in that instance. He spent 50 years in prison because he was in the Black Liberation Army. I think he went in when he was 19 and he got out when he was 69 years old.
Yeah.
And after 50 years, he got out and he was more active the day he got out than I am on an average day. And he hasn't stopped. He's
Yeah.
just as active now. It's amazing to see that.
Yeah. I would think that groups like Anarchist Black Cross also contribute to hopefully lifting spirits. Friends of mine in when I lived in Houston for a long time were like Houston ABC. And every Sunday they had like letter writing parties to send to those folks who were behind bars. People who've been in, like we said, former Black Panthers who've been in for decades.
Yeah, absolutely. The Anarchist Black Cross has been doing that for probably 25, maybe 30 years now. And it's really amazing work. It's thankless work in a lot of ways, in the general sense, but when you do find out the impact that it has on people inside, it is really heartwarming. Um, and that goes not only with, like you said, letter writing and holiday or birthday card writing to political prisoners, but also events like Running Down the Walls, which is an annual fundraiser that the ABC does to raise awareness and funds for political prisoners.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot of organizations doing things like that. There's the Jericho movement, which has been doing that for decades and also has a newsletter, which Jalil Muntakim has been involved in. And lots of organizations all around the US, some not as large as those. Yeah.
I'm curious, I would call it like the diversity of the people that you have in the book, which is people who did bank robberies and armored car robberies and things like that, to people who are involved in the plowshares movement, to younger anarchist adjacent folks who tried to bankrupt companies. And I'm just curious what played into you and Eric's thinking about how you selected people for the book.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I have to say, I think we're both really proud of the selection and of the contributors who did decide to contribute to the book. There's a wide range of people from many different movements and generations, like you said. Initially, I think because I'm a part of the Certain Days Calendar Collective, and I also write to maybe 24 people that are in prison. So I tend to have maybe more connections to people in prison than some others do. And I did take advantage of those connections for this book. All of the members that are still alive of the Certain Days Collective are included, as well as Oso Blanco, an indigenous prisoner who I do another project with to raise money for the Zapatistas. That's called Children's Art Project. But I did have to also reach out to a lot of other people because I don't have the same connections. I didn't communicate with people that were in prison in the 70s and 80s because I wasn't born until 82. So some of those connections relied upon other people, and people were very generous with sharing it because I think they saw the value of a project like this that captures so much history. That said, there were people who didn't want to participate. There were people who thought that enough words have been said, that actions are needed to start tearing down prison walls as opposed to simply talking about it. There were people who suffered horrible traumas in prison that still aren't able to talk about it, that aren't able to communicate that, or didn't want to relive the trauma of doing so.
Were there a good number of folks that you reached out to who didn't respond or didn't want to participate?
Yeah, I'd say I completed 40 interviews. There's, I believe, 35 or 36 in the book. I sent it was a questionnaire with 25 questions initially.
Mm-hmm.
I sent that to about 75 people. I didn't hear back from about half.
Mm-hmm.
There were a few that maybe we wouldn't have even included in the book project, but we thought it would be interesting to hear what they had to say.
Mm-hmm.
And then there were also a few people who just, like I interviewed one member of the Symbionese Liberation Army, and he thought it was such a good interview and such a good project that he told other members of the Symbionese Liberation Army. So things like that, word of mouth, also helped to get a wide range of people.
And probably looking through the table of contents and the interviews, the name that probably the most known name that's jumped out at me was Chelsea Manning. And I'm wondering, was Chelsea very active? Was she excited to engage with the project? Or I'm a little bit curious about I guess I'm a little bit starstruck. So I'd like to hear a little bit about how the engagement with Chelsea went in the project.
Sure. Yeah. So like I said earlier, I live in Eugene now, but I used to live in Baltimore for almost 2 decades. And while I was there, I hosted a yearly Certain Days calendar event every December or so to raise funds for the calendar and sub calendars and talk about political prisoners. And one year I hosted an event that had Eddie Conway, former Black Panther political prisoner, Daniel McGowan of the Earth Liberation Front, and one of the current, at the time, J20 defendants from the Trump inauguration. And Chelsea actually came to that. And we got to talk for a bit after that. And then I actually saw them a few months later at a Godspeed You Black Emperor show. So yeah, I guess I had those things to fall back on when I asked them to do the interview. And I'm glad they did, because I think the things they had to say are really amazing.
So issues around prison abolition and political prisoners are often marginalized compared to other issues that are popular with left social movements. But the state is escalating against protests and direct action. We saw a lot of that in 2020 during the George Floyd uprising, but we've been seeing a lot with the RICO indictments and the domestic terror charges in the Stop Cop City campaign and the state response to that. How much of a merger, how much of overlap are you beginning to see around issues around prison abolition and some of these more popular issues or campaigns?
Yeah, that's a great question. I do think we're seeing more of it and more of it as time goes by, as state repression continues to increase. I don't think we're at the level that we need to be at. And that level, I think that we can look to the Palestinians, to the Irish, to their nationalist struggles and their struggles for self-autonomy as guideposts for us, as ways to incorporate political prisoners not only into our movements, but into our daily lives, which is something that Sarah Falconer, a fellow Certain Days Collective member, really touches on in the introduction to the book. It's just, it's about including them as much as possible into our lives and not letting political prisoners feel like they're left behind, like the bars are actually creating any more of a barrier than they need to. But that said, I do think that hopefully people find the beautiful artwork on this book by Josh McPhee, Just Seed's artist, so compelling that they're willing to pick it up even when they don't really necessarily know what a political prisoner is. That's my hope. And I think that the conversations that the people in this book have are conversations that many people, that anyone I think will be able to connect with at some point to some degree. These are conversations that like I said, started 4 years ago. So we cover Ukraine, COVID, Palestine. These are conversations that cover all of these because they're things that political prisoners have in mind. They realize that these movements are all connected and that the fight that they're in prison for is connected to the same struggle going on in the streets.
It's interesting when we first connected, which was just a couple of weeks ago. This is for the audience. Josh and I connected at a panel at the Howard Zinn Book Fair in San Francisco, where Josh co-hosted a panel on the book, which included a number of elder people, organizers and troublemakers, whatever, who had been involved in a lot of anti-empire stuff, anti-imperialism work, and then also included at least one younger political prisoner, which was Jake Conroy, who was been on the show many times. Folks are familiar. He went to jail for the work he did with Stop Huntington Animal Cruelty. But that was actually a really important point that I think was made on that panel, which is that it was connecting issues. It's people who are resisting the corporate state around animal testing versus the corporate state around making bombs or what have you. Is actually a really important thing to do, which I also don't think happens enough in movements. I feel like there's so much siloing still around issues and around struggle that it's deeply problematic. I think it's one of the things that holds us back as a movement, actually.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I hope that this book at least does some small part to combat that. I wrote the footnotes, which is initially I thought it was challenging, but it was actually really a joy to write that in just like a really quick run through history, through radical history, just writing the footnotes through the book. But I do hope that it provides some sort of history to people so that they can see that these are all connected, that the repression that people in prison saw during the AIDS pandemic is really not that different than what we're seeing today or what we saw a few years ago with regard to the COVID pandemic. And that the repression and the struggles that people were fighting for in the 70s, 50 years ago, is the same thing that's happening today.
Seems like most of the folks in the book are people who had been political and went to jail for their political crimes. But then there's also a There's a lot of people who got politicized or radicalized while they were in prison. I'm very close with some of the folks who did the support for the Angola Three, for example, they all went to jail for seemingly like mostly non-political crimes, but then organized as the Black Panthers in the Angola State Prison and ended up getting many more years and spending something like 28. One Robert King Wilkerson spent something like 28 years in solitary confinement. And I'm wondering if the book speaks to folks like that as well.
Yeah, I think so. And yeah, Albert Woodfox was one. I talked to him briefly about this project before he passed away, but he passed away a year or two ago after, what was it, 45 years in solitary confinement at Angola.
Yeah. And then other prisons, I think, too.
Yeah, true. New York, where I think he met some of the Panther 21 while he was inside. But Eric King, the co-editor of the book, he is a member of the Fire Ant Collective, which is an anarchist political prisoner, or not political prisoner, but anarchist prisoner support group and zine. They make a newsletter that's really cool. And I communicate with a few members of that collective. So I decided to reach out to the 5 or so collective members to see if they'd also like to participate. And for the most part, those people are what you'd term politicized prisoners, people who were convicted of crimes and became more politically conscious while they were imprisoned. And in terms of the book, that includes Sean Swain, Jennifer Rose, Michael Kimball. I'm sure I'm forgetting one or two others. Marius Mason, although Marius's actions, I think they would be considered a political prisoner. But yeah, I tried to reach out to, what you would consider anarchist prisoners as well, to find out how they've survived and how they've not only maintain the politics, but also learn those politics from a place of confinement.
Have you been able to get this book inside, or has there been any effort to try and send this to people in prison so they can read it?
So one of the stipulations I had when I signed up to do it with AK Press was that all the contributors should get a free copy, and about half the contributors are in prison. So far, I've found out from a few people that they have got it. Eric was able to get it with no problem at the ADX prison, the most secure prison in the country. Oso Blanco is another prisoner who got a copy and makes a point of calling me after each chapter to tell me what he thinks of it, which is really great. But there are other prisoners. Zinn, who is a jailhouse lawyer in Texas and a Certain Days Collective member, he told me that the book is being reviewed and he hasn't seen a copy of it yet. I doubt he will, but hopefully we will continue to fight.
Is he in federal or Texas state prison?
He's in the Texas state prison. And I found out recently that the 2 members of the Virgin Island 3 that participated in the book have also not yet received copies. So it's an ongoing, that's something we have to deal with the calendar as well, as just the amount of mail that gets restricted or held back from people inside.
Right.
But I do hope that it gets inside. I do hope that it's helpful for people not only facing time inside, like those down in Cop City in Atlanta, but also for people inside to be able to communicate and feel like they're a part of a movement and learn and grow with fellow political prisoners.
What are your plans to further promote the book? I met you at a book fair and you're doing podcasts. So I'm wondering if there's any other strategy to help promote it.
Yeah. I'd like to promote it as much as possible. Like you, I have a full-time job, so that takes up the majority of my time.
Yeah,
but
it's working sucks, I gotta say.
I know, it really doesn't it? But there's a Facebook page for the book. There's a website for the book, although it's still a work in progress. I've got an event in Brooklyn, New York on Sunday, December 17th at the Word is Change, and then another event in Baltimore on December 21st at Red Emma's bookstore.
Nice.
Yeah, I'm hoping to also do some events in the new year here in the Pacific Northwest, and parole restrictions pending. Hopefully Eric can join for some of those or some of these events, or even do his own events from where he is in Colorado.
My final question is, this is for the benefit of the audience because I know the answer to this, but what can folks who are listening to the Green and Red podcast do to support political prisoners?
Great question. First thing I think would be to buy the book. And that's not only just me, trying to get you to buy this book that I made. The book was created, the calendar, as a fundraiser for political prisoners and a way to raise awareness for people. So 100% of the proceeds from the calendar and the book are donated In the case of the book, 50% of those proceeds go to the ABC, the Anarchist Black Cross War Chest, which provides monthly stipends to currently imprisoned political prisoners. So it provides a lifeline and a way of support to those currently in prison so that they can survive and hopefully impact those around them. And hopefully the sales of this book will allow them to have a little more money on their books each month. And then 50% of the book also goes to the family of Eric King so that he has some sort of support, some sort of cushion to fall back on now that he's out of prison. So that would be the number one way: buy a calendar, buy a book. Really, though, just write to someone inside. The ABC does an illustrated guide where it has the addresses and names and a short bio of all people that are currently in prison for political reasons. And just writing to one of them and creating a relationship, creating a bond is really moving and helpful and creates a lifeline for those inside. So I can't recommend it enough.
Excellent. I'm going to wrap it there. Folks, you've been listening to Josh Davidson, who is a certain collective calendar or a certain days calendar collective member.
You got it.
You can email the Green and Red Podcast, @Gmail, and get a copy of it with a donation to GNR, because we've made our donation to certain days. And then Josh is also the co-editor with Eric King of Rattling the Cages, which he just talked about. And there's the book right there. And we'll have a link in the show notes where you can buy it online. And then Josh is a prison abolitionist and does a lot of prisoner support work out there. And so definitely get engaged and think about how this relates to issues that you're working on, whether they're environmental or whether they're anti-war or what have you. Josh, it's been great talking with you today. Thanks for coming on.
Yeah, same here. Thank you so much for having me.
And folks out there, if you like what you're hearing, please check us out on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. If you're watching this on YouTube, hit subscribe. If you're listening to us on one of our many audio platforms, give us a rate and review. And then if you really like what you're hearing, especially since it's the end of the year, give us a donation at greenredpodcast.org, and you can hit the support button or become a patron at patreon.com/green and red podcast. And we will talk to you all again soon.
Run down cities, run by pigs, taking our rights away from